This evening there's going to be a lecture by Lorens Holm, and at the same time it's partly to celebrate the publication of his book, which you can see represented up there. When you have been amazed and delighted by the lecture, you can buy it in the South Jury Room. So there you see Brunelleschi Lacan Le Corbusier. Lorens is now, Lorens is reader at Dundee University in the Geddes Institute for Urban Research. And before that, it was in London, where he did his PhD at the London Consortium. And while doing that, he was very successfully a teacher in the diploma program here at the AA, and has taught also at the Bartlett, the Mackintosh, and before that, before he came to do his research, he taught in Washington University in St. Louis. In addition to other publications, this really is a kind of edited version of the thesis, which I can recall impressed the external examiners enormously. And it's a great pleasure to welcome him to lecture here at the AA, though it's hardly the first time. So, Lorens Holm.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Oh, Jesus. I don't know if that's me or that, but you better creep away very, very quickly or something. I have to say I'm incredibly pleased and excited to be here. I'm probably going to be so excited I'm going to do something foolish like trip and fall on my face or something, and have to laugh about it. The one thing that Mark didn't mention is that he was my PhD supervisor. So to a certain extent, I'm doubly kind of pleased to be here and recirculating back to him a series of ideas that, to some extent, he had a part in shaping. What I'm going to do, I'm going to read some bits of this talk and also then simply just talk for some other bits. If you like the lecture, please go buy the book. And if you don't like the lecture, actually buy the book anyway, and because the book might be better than the lecture. So anyway, I'm going to begin with a little bit of reading, and then I'll stop that. My recent book, Brunelleschi Lacan Le Corbusier, is a close reading of key texts in architecture, psychoanalysis, and philosophy. It argues that we use architecture and other forms of spatial practice like painting to construct our subjectivity. Other texts have argued that we use these practices to construct social relations. I argue that we use architecture to construct the relations between the elements of the Freudian psyche. We usually regard these relations as inner, so that implied in this argument is a congruence between inner and outer worlds. This congruence and a basic familiarity with psychoanalysis was assumed by the great 20th century historians of architecture writing in the 50s and 60s, people like Gideon and Mumford. So in a sense, I'm simply returning to an older discourse. Now, the book was conceived as a dialogue. Just timing-wise, the book was conceived as a dialogue about space between Brunelleschi, who invented perspective by subjecting what we see to a rigorous geometric regime that bound space to its viewer and gave it a measure, and a dialogue between Brunelleschi and Le Corbusier, for whom that geometry seemed to unravel again in a psychical crisis which heralded his entry into spatial discourse, and which he would look back upon and codify as ineffable space. Le Corbusier felt those bounds loosen so that he and the space he viewed got all floaty again. If this is a dialogue between Brunelleschi and Le Corbusier, then Lacan, who's one of the most important post-Freudian theorists of psychoanalysis, and perhaps the closest reader of Freud's texts, is their interlocutor. Now, they are here represented by the front and back covers of the book. The back cover shows Brunelleschi's nave of San Lorenzo, which he designed shortly after inventing perspective. The front cover shows the young Généré, Le Corbusier before his name change and rebirth as the greatest architect of the 20th century, standing amongst the stones of the Parthenon on his fateful first trip. Lacan is represented by this column, this one, which I carefully managed to get so it would fall on the spine of the book. Whoops, see, I said I was going to fall over. Lacan is represented by this column carefully placed on the spine between the images, for it is Lacan's text, and in particular, his account of desire in the visual field and his interpretation of Freud's account of the death drive that props up this dialogue and my argument. Now, in this case, it's a Corinthian prop. When Lacan says in the Ethics of Psychoanalysis that architecture, like painting, is organized around emptiness, he projects architecture, like subjectivity, into the register of loss. And subsequently, when he says of visual experience in the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, which is probably his most well-known text, when he says that I am looked at, ... I am a picture, and then I am photographed, he argues that our presence to ourselves in the world is dependent upon the image-making experiences of others. So the book explores the affinity between space and the psyche, what we might call the outer world of space and the inner world of the psyche, except that in the end it's not at all clear that they are outer and inner. This affinity should be at least intuitively plausible, if not obvious, if only because space and the psyche share many of the same characteristics. We peer through space as we peer out through our own subjectivity to see objects. They both share that paradoxical feature of being nowhere all around us, and we become most aware of them when they become occluded, space and the psyche. It has been the task of this project to make these affinities more precise. Now, of course, this dialogue is fictional. There's no way that a 15th century Italian Renaissance architect could have a dialogue with a French 20th century one. It's also fictional because Lacan is not their interlocutor. I am. I wrote the book. I put them together, not Lacan. In fact, he mentions neither. I am interested in developing a role for first-person singular research. I do not accept that the only basis for one's work applying to others is that its subjectivity is repressed. We are all subjects, and it is on account of our subjectivity and the subjectivity embedded in our work that our work can claim to be universal. The dialogue, however fictional, is important because it is a way of staking out two poles of spatial experience that together seem to define the spectrum of spatial experience. Now, I first became interested in psychoanalysis through the diagrams of psychoanalysis because, and this is simply a kind of scattering of diagrams. Most of them are from either Lacan or Freud. My book discusses this one, the visual field, Lacan's diagram of the visual field, and Lacan's diagram of the drives. It focuses on those two. But I became interested in psychoanalysis because it seemed to me that the diagrams were incredibly, ineluctably spatial. And it seemed to me that if psychoanalysis had to resort to diagrams like this to explain the relationships of the components of the psyche, then it must be a kind of architecture, and it must be openable, uppable to architects by architects. So now, I think the first thing I need to do is say, well, actually, I'll say a few more words about these images. The text basically spends most of its effort contemplating these two images. We've just seen them on the cover of the book. The cover of the book is kind of a diagram for the argument, really. But I'll just say a couple more words about them. It should be immediately obvious that they have quite divergent properties. This one, if anything, is in depth going in and out of the page. And in this one, the space, that's represented in the image. In this one, the space seems quite shallow, and if it has a structure, it's a kind of a laminated, a kind of a layered structure of which the grease and dirt and grime on the actual surface of the image itself, it's a very old scratched image, that the surface of the image itself is perhaps the top surface of that space. I should just also say, and this is perhaps a little bit more important for my argument, that there are two quite different relationships at work here. In this one, we can see an object of desire, in this case an altar, that is presented to us as if it were a certain distance, about 5 or 6 intercolumnations, away from an invisible viewer. In this one, the viewer, the subject of the space, the subject of desire, is very visible, and to the extent that his objects are visible, things like the column and the platform of the Parthenon, to the extent that they are visible, it's not at all clear that the relationship between them can be so clearly defined with a measuring tape. Okay. Now, I'm going to leave that for the minute, and I should say a little bit about perspective, what it's about. The book spends a lot of time talking about Brunelleschi's demonstration. Basically, Brunelleschi, we actually don't know. I should say we don't know how Brunelleschi invented perspective, unlike people like Leonardo. He left no notebooks. But all we have is an account of how he demonstrated it to the good people of Florence. And essentially what he did, he stood somebody in the facade, in the doorway of the Florence Cathedral, and painted a painting from that position of the baptistry. Now, I just say a little bit more about that. I said that we don't have his notebooks. We don't know how he did this. We don't even have the perspective painting that he did. He was an architect. The painting maybe wasn't very good. It might have been chucked out after the demonstration. But art historians, and in particular Hubert Damisch, speculates that it looked something like this, that this ideal city from, this is 1460-odd, was probably part of a transformation series of paintings that began with Brunelleschi's, which would have shown the not circular but octagonal baptistry kind of framed in the piazza, radiated kind of perspectivated space. So it might have looked something like that. Now, what Brunelleschi did, as I said, he stood in the doorway of the cathedral, and he painted a painting of this thing. And then he then drilled a hole in the vanishing point of the painting, he grabbed somebody off the streets of Florence, had them stand framed by the portal, in other words, in the same position that Brunelleschi was in when he painted this painting. He had them put the painting up over their face, peering through the eye hole at the vanishing point, looking at the baptistry in the distance. He had the painting facing outwards so that if I was doing the experiment, you would be seeing the painted side. And then he had the person put a mirror up so they would first see a reflected image of the painting of the view, then drop the mirror, see the view of the baptistry, flip it up again, see the painted image of the view up and down, and so it goes. It's usually understood by, the role of the mirror is usually understood by art historians as a device simply to demonstrate the veracity of the painted image of the view to the view. Now, I mean, there's a lot that one could say about that. I'm simply not going to say it tonight, but it should be obvious that, you know, the fact that this viewer is seeing an image of themselves, even if they're sort of all gussied up in baptistry drag, sort of on the way to like a Bauhaus ball, introduces questions about narcissism and identity that take this beyond simply a demonstration of veracity. Okay. Now, this is just to show you the sort of a couple of my diagrams of the up and down position. This is the plan of the cathedral with the viewer's head here staring from behind the painting, cone of vision, to the baptistry here. This is now with the mirror up and seeing seeing a reflection of the painting in its virtual position here, which, if we believe the relationships that had to obtain in the demonstration, which is a kind of perfect mapping onto the image of the baptistry itself. Now, just to say that the important thing, and then this is someone else's diagram showing that kind of thing happening with the mirror, and that's Brunelleschi there, who's very closely watching this exercise. Now, I should just say that and I'm going to get to in a minute, that the really important thing is that diagram that we can draw of the demonstration matches, it's almost identical to the diagram that Lacan publishes of what he calls the visual field. And it's something that I've noticed. I've known about it for a long time, and I never found anybody who ever mentioned that. It seems so blindingly obvious, but be that as it may. So if there is a kind of a discovery in my book, I guess it's probably that relationship. Now, so that's the demonstration in a nutshell. I guess I just want to say something about how fantastically important the invention of perspective was for architecture, and actually remains so even without the sort of classical orders. I've just put Brunelleschi's Nave of San Lorenzo up there as a kind of reference, but what I really want to talk about is this plate from Andrea Pozzo's book on Treatise on Architecture and Painting from about 1700, so it's a good almost 300 years after Brunelleschi. What he's showing is how he's showing this church that seems not to have a choir, and he's showing the extension of the nave into a choir as a kind of exercise in projection. So he has this person standing here, looking through this kind of framed opening and projecting, extending the space of the choir, and up at the top you can see it in a kind of elevation as a kind of a view. And essentially, at this point, it's possible to understand architectural space, whether it's interior or exterior, as a kind of projection of the subject occupant. Okay. Now, I want to say a little bit about Lacan's diagram, say a little bit about what the visual field is, how it's constituted, because it's a kind of, you can see it's a kind of a doubling of this sort of perspective cone of vision. Subject of representation essentially means, at least today for this lecture, it means the viewer, which might be that guy, and you can see the cone of vision. The gaze, for the moment, we'll just regard as the object that viewer is viewing. Now, the visual field for Lacan has really two components. There's this cone of vision, in other words, my visual field. We'll talk about my visual field. My visual field is essentially two things. It's the cone of vision that radiates out from my eye or my eyes. Effectively, it's sort of everything I see, and I guess I can see out my cone of vision is about to here or something. And in addition to that, it's everything that you see, okay, especially, or that you see insofar as you convey back to me what you see, either by words, images, postcards, body language, memos, or architecture, okay? So, and especially when what you see includes me in it, okay? So my visual field, as I said, is both what I see and what you see of me insofar as you have ways of conveying it back to me. Now, and it's just not, it's not only you. I mean, included in my visual field is even like the adoring gaze of my mother, okay? You know, my mother's in New York. She still has this view of me as this wonderful, all-powerful son who can do anything. And I assure you that that image, you know, is operating right now in here in this room for me. So, you know, the visual field is really a rather entangled and overlapped thing. And so Lacan shows that as a kind of other cone of vision coming back, okay, which, in a sense, captures me, okay, in someone else's picture. Now, although Lacan doesn't make a distinction between image and picture, I think it helps to sort of clarify these two things. I call the image whatever it is that's coming into my eyeball, okay, and the picture everything that's coming back to me from others. So basically, you know, the image for me is what's sort of radiating out like so, and the picture that I find myself in when you convey back to me what you see, that's represented by this thing, and that's the picture. Okay. Now, for the most part, we're not really aware of that second cone of vision. I mean, we usually become aware of it like if we walk into a room full of people and they suddenly become silent for a moment, and you suddenly realize, oh, gee, you know, and everyone's kind of looking at you. There's certain moments like that where it happens. It will happen as soon as it'll happen to this guy, as soon as somebody walks into the room and exposes him as a kind of 15th century, 16th century pornographer, you know, who's posing as an artist. Someone's going to walk into the room, and suddenly he'll realize that he's not able to hide completely behind that little kind of pyramid thing, and you know, he's sort of caught, caught in his own desire. Another good example of it is in that movie Heat, where Al Pacino, who's the good guys with the police, is kind of in a feud with Robert De Niro, who's the bad guys. And on a tip-off, Pacino goes to this huge kind of kind of a construction site or something, because he thinks that they'll be able to find De Niro and his gang there, so they'll be able to identify them. They don't know who these people are, and they get this tip-off that they're going to be there. So they go in the hope of finally figuring out who these people are who are pulling off all these robberies. And they're standing in the middle of this huge space, and suddenly De Niro realizes, Pacino, the policeman, realizes that the whole thing was a setup, and actually they were called there to be in the center of this space so that De Niro and his bad guys could see who they were. And at that moment, he bursts out laughing. And it's that sort of release of energy, when you realize actually that you have a visual field, and that visual field is the field of the other, what Lacan calls the field of the other, and you're right smack in it. Okay. Now I'm just gonna. I don't feel I need to really say anything about this, so I'm not going to. It's all just different versions of that thing. Now, I want to return to the presentation, the demonstration of perspective for a minute, because I want to say a little bit more about image and picture and how different they are and kind of how disturbing and disruptive they are. And talk a little bit about the fantasies, as it were, in perspective, because the basic the basic assumption of this, of course, is that Brunelleschi's painted image, his picture of the baptistry, will kind of like exactly match the baptistry, the view of the baptistry, right? So here's my image of the demonstration. I'm standing there, okay, looking at the baptistry, and then here for a minute is Brunelleschi's picture of it. And the fantasy is that they kind of perfectly align, okay? So, of course, if we imagine that they're in two different registers, like one is a painting and one is a view, okay, and here sort of represented by two different photos, you can see that that alignment or that coincidence between them might never quite work, okay? You could imagine, either imagine it this way with a kind of blurred thing, or a kind of oscillation between them, which would be the mirror up, the mirror down, the mirror up. Now, it's possible to go to Florence and kind of like survey that space with a camera, sort of triangulate it with a camera. And what I've shown here is this is just someone else's sketch plan of the demonstration. I have two photos, one from this position here, this one, which is from this position from the loggia, and another one which is from the position of this little column thing, looking back at the central door. Just want to catch up on my reading for a minute here. Okay. What I want to do with this is if we just take this one for a moment, you can sort of imagine what I've drawn here is another diagram of another version of that basic diagram I showed. This one maybe is showing Brunelleschi, who's standing watching his demonstrator demonstrate perspective, okay, which would itself be another one of these kind of visual field diagrams, sort of from the position of somebody in this loggia looking at that thing. And you can imagine that if you were to ask, most people think that the sort of the picture of the demonstration is that ideal city panel showing the perfect sort of rotunda. In other words, the panel that Brunelleschi painted. But actually, the sort of picture of the sort of originary scene of perspective is much more likely to have been from a position like this, what Brunelleschi saw or what some of the crowds would have seen looking back at the thing. You can imagine somebody standing in that door doing that thing with the mirror. And so we can kind of, if we were to sort of montage those two together, the image that the demonstrator sees with the picture of the scene that everybody else sees, we get something, even more kind of conflictive and fractured. Okay. So I just the point of sort of rehearsing this kind of or reenacting the demonstration in these terms is simply to show how potentially kind of destabilizing and the whole kind of dialogic relationship is between what the viewer thinks they're engaged in and the picture. The picture that they find themselves in. And it's this kind of, when Lacan talks about the illusion of perspective, or the illusion of, he says the illusion of space, he says perspective is the illusion of space. One of the things he means is that perspective gives us this very kind of tidy fantasy, as it were, that we're always in the center of our space and the master of it. It's a kind of a fantasy of omnipotence, as it were. And actually, anything but that is happening in the visual field. Okay. Now, I want to kind of stop with Brunelleschi for a minute, and I want to jump to my second kind of originary scene. I want to jump to Le Corbusier. I think I just want to, before I do that, I just want to say one more word about this thing about space and how perspective is this kind of illusion of space. Because Lacan means it actually in a number of ways. I've just said something about this idea that image and picture are somehow coincident. But there's a little bit more to it, and I began to touch on it before, because when he talks about this kind of one-point perspective scene, he says that that what the perspective is doing is it's suppressing or it's repressing the possibility of understanding desire and loss by interpretation, and suppressing it in favor of this idea that you can attain your objects simply by walking down a nave. Okay, you can walking down the aisle, walking X number of feet, whatever, a certain dimension to get to something you want, is a kind of fiction, because we all know that you never get what you want. Okay, and I mean you may. And we all know that, no matter how close you are to your lover, that you don't have your lover. You can't be your lover. And far more important than contemplating the fictitious possibility that having your objects is simply a matter of walking over to them and getting them, which is what this promotes. Lacan wants to say that desire is a matter of objects and how you understand your relationship to them, which is much more depends much more on interpretation. Now, in this one, I think it's I mean, Lacan doesn't talk about either of these, but I think here we're beginning to see a completely different idea about desire. Desire here is, Le Corbusier is amongst the objects that will become his object type and his sort of urban elements. There's the pilotis and the sky and the sun and all of these things. He's basically surrounded by his objects, which is probably why he looks so miserable. But it's simply the nature of that space which doesn't allow us to so easily maintain the fiction that we can simply get to our objects as a matter of metrics. Okay. Now, I want to say, I want to now go to Le Corbusier's encounter with the Parthenon, because it's really quite extraordinary. This is taken from The Voyage to the Orient, the book that he writes about it, and I've just, I mean, it's readily available. I've simply edited it for you here, some of the sort of pertinent quotes. I mean, he really had a crisis. So, he says, he talks about the entablature, I can't read it. Yes, the entablature of a cruel rigidity crushes and terrorizes. Okay, the Parthenon, a terrible machine, grinds and dominates. 2,000 years are obliterated. I mean, it's this incredible, kind of scenario of persecution. I mean, it's not something I'm going to get into, but anybody that knows Melanie Klein will probably recognize the paranoid schizophrenic position here. Now, I want to read something about this account. Okay. No other architect continues to generate so many words and images, either directly or indirectly. Buildings, models, photographs, drawings, sketches, paintings, books, catalogs, magazines, papers, exhibitions. In 1965, at the end of an illustrious career, Le Corbusier, the greatest architect of the 20th century, the only architect to be given a state funeral, a month before his death, submitted for publication a manuscript, this one, he had written 50-odd years earlier at the very beginning of his career. At the age of 24, Le Corbusier embarked on an architectural tour of Europe, which he claimed to be his formative educational trip, the trip that made him an architect. This manuscript, Voyage to the Orient, was his travelogue. The highlight of the tour was the Acropolis. This first encounter with the Parthenon was traumatic, for reasons we will never know. Corb felt interrogated and ravaged by it. He had to shield himself from its gaze, as if it shone too brightly. His view was attended by spatial anxiety. It seemed too far away and too close at the same time. He sees it in relation to its surroundings, but not in terms of foreground, middle ground, background, rather in an economy of materials and loss from whose circuit he is excluded. Okay, that's sort of, I think I'm referring to this thing here, the marble wounds. Although he does not say it, it does not conform to his expectations of space. Anthony Vidler attributed this to his presense of ineffable space. Generet was not safe from the Parthenon because it seemed to defy the perspectival logic of near-far. In psychoanalytic terms, perspective failed to defend him against the object he so desperately wanted. At the end of his life, he confessed in a single added last sentence to the Voyage manuscript. Here, I'm 20 years old and cannot answer. At the end of his life, he confessed in a single added last sentence to the voyaged manuscript that he still could not answer the challenge that the Parthenon had asked of him so many years before, suggesting that between first encounter and last will and testament, that's his words, spanned a career that he pictured, at least with respect to the Parthenon, as repetition without change. A temporal instability seems to answer to the earlier felt spatial instability. The peculiar use of the present tense, the I am, and the inaccurate invocation of his youth, he's 24, not 20, have the effect of projecting him back to this formative moment and eliding his career. When he stands at the end of his career, gazing back at his now lost youth and gazing forward at the still unattained Parthenon, he acknowledges that the promise of the Parthenon was unfulfilled. He's mourning the loss of something that he never had. Okay. Now, so you see what happened. He submits this thing for publication on his deathbed, virtually, having written it as a travelogue, essentially wrote it while he was traveling, adding only this last sentence. Now, in the book, this was a point of departure for a discussion of Lacan's account of the drive, the death drive, because for Lacan all drives lead to death, because in the register of the drive, all life is repetition without end, difference without change. I'm not going to kind of go there in this lecture because I want to kind of get to something else which I'm just beginning to think about. But I should just say that another reason why perspective was so important for Lacan, so symptomatic, as it were, is because perspective gave vision its object, the vanishing point. And for the first time, it was vision. It was possible to speak about vision as if it were structured in a way that such that vision could have an object. Okay, for the first time, this vanishing point gives vision an object. Okay, it's an abstract object, more a position than an object, but an object nevertheless. And hence, for the first time, it was possible to talk about a visual drive, because the drive in drive theory, the subject is always the drive always has an object that the subject keeps returning to incessantly. So, in other words, a drive or desire to follow that object, which in effect is in this case it would be the desire to vanish and become space. Okay, and I think that we could actually coin a verb, or coin the word space as a verb and talk about to space something or spacing, so you could make space or become space. You could make space, want space, have space, and finally become it. And then simply architecture is understood as simply one way of engaging in this spatial drive. So that's very important for Lacan, and it's important in the book. I'll just show you a sequence of images that speak about that, but then, as I said, I'm going to get on to something else. Because what I try to show is that the Parthenon, or rather the truth of the Parthenon, is Corb's object, and that his career can be understood as this kind of repetition of Parthenon signifiers. And so that's just this kind of, I have a kind of a sequence here which, in other words, if we can understand a career as driven, as having an object, then it has this kind of drive structure, and we can understand everything that we do as this kind of, all the buildings, all the exhibitions, all the writings, everything that we do is a kind of repetition, always sort of honing in on this, but never attaining this object. And so if we look at his work, this is the whole history of Corb's career in 15 seconds. If we look at this work, this career in this way, we begin with these photos, which were the ones like the one that I've been obsessing on, these three photos, these two and this one here, were taken during his trip to the Acropolis. These are published by a chap named Grisleri in the 70s, but until then had been buried in his archive. Corb then represents the Parthenon towards a new architecture. In that book, invents or presents for the first time his Maison Domino, which is a kind of Parthenon, not simply because it's sort of at the same angle as Zevi's photo of the Parthenon, but because it kind of, and not simply either because it's a structural diagram, but because it represents the truth, as it were, in Corb's work in the way that the Parthenon does. Also, towards an architecture, he begins publishing these details of the Parthenon, where it's kind of, he uses the camera to kind of reduce the Parthenon to its component parts. It's Corb's object type, as it were, as if the Parthenon wasn't already a series of component parts. And then represents his own work in that same way. The other images, probably you recognize it from Chandragar. His buildings have this kind of, certainly Ronchamp does this, very edgy, neither inside, outside types of space, which are kind of signifiers of the Parthenon colonnade. And so it goes, and it's possible to map that out in certain ways. This is sort of Colin Rowe versus Corb, Colin Rowe's version, I should say, in the vertical axis. And then this is mine simply showing a series of these images around this thing. If you would ask somebody, what does a career look like? And you'd say, well, what kind of career? And you'd say, well, a really driven one that has an object. It might look something like this. So. Now, I want to, I realize I've kind of skirted over the whole question of the drive, because I actually wanted to, I've begun thinking about something else, and that is the possibility of talking about neurotic and psychotic space. Okay. Now, I made this comment about Corb having a kind of paranoid schizophrenic reaction on the Parthenon, where he feels persecuted by this bad object, this terrible machine that grinds and drives him. I'm not for a minute suggesting that he's psychotic. I mean, I simply have no way of knowing, and I don't know if anybody has a way of knowing. But it seems to me that he's beginning to get at a kind of space, a kind of psychotic space, this kind of space that isn't quite so embedded in this kind of symbolic edifice, which is Lacan's field of the other, or its kind of reduced version, illusionary version, the sort of perspective diagram. And I want to just talk a little bit more about that, because it seems to me that this is just going back to Brunelleschi's diagram, that we can talk about this kind of almost incessant necessity to kind of bring the picture and the image together to kind of get it right, this kind of almost incessant way of being more accurate. We can begin to talk about that as a kind of neurotic space. In other words, always this idea of always being caught out by someone else's gaze, always walking into the room full of people and having everybody fall silent, always having your thoughts interrupted by this idea that actually I'm in this space not for myself, but for somebody else. That, and then desperately trying to bring those two things in alignment. That seems to me to be a kind of what I'm calling neurotic. And then what's happened to Corb, where he feels when he goes to the Parthenon and he's simply exposed. There's sort of like nothing's there for him to kind of structure him, to shield him from this thing. I've simply indicated by imagining like all of that other stuff, all of that perspectival armature fading away so that finally one is simply left with one's object. So I think what I'm going to do is conclude by reading this last bit, which I ask you to keep these two bits in mind. I just say, I mean, this is kind of, it's a little gimmicky, it's a little cheesy, and I just apologize, but I'm just trying to show this way of things, this kind of symbolic armature that positions me versus you in a space beginning to fade away. So in conclusion, I want to speculate about the possibilities of neurotic and psychotic space. A number of my colleagues and I have been discussing the possibilities of bringing the psychoanalytic categories of neurotic, psychotic, and perverse, okay, perhaps others, I'm not sure, to bear on problems of architectural discourse in the way that, like, class and gender have been or are currently brought to bear on architectural problems, gender and class struggle. And so the comparison between Brunelleschi and Le Corbusier allows us to sketch out two different subjective positions, the neurotic and the psychotic. The one, neurotic, I'll just go back to that, is inside, the one position is inside space where normal architectural relations of inside and outside seem to work. This position seeks to repress interpretation as a way for the subject to come to grips with loss and desire, because it represents to the desiring subject the illusion that its objects are attainable. This, as I have said, is the path to the altar, but not to love. The other position, the psychotic one, that's now here, is outside space as we normally know it, where it is not possible to be either inside or outside, because the symbolic apparatus that makes these positions meaningful is not available to the subject of experience. We glimpse this position in the snapshot of Corb on the Acropolis and in his trajectorial accounts of ineffable space. Desire obviously exists in some form for Corb, in the sense that his objects exist, and he's amongst them. He's amongst the platforms and the columns, the sun, sea, and the air that will become his objective and his elements of urbanism. But they're not organized spatially for him, and he can only give ecstatic accounts of their matrix. Now, I just have a quote here from his account of ineffable space, which is from that book, The New World of Space. In fact, he attributes it, he says it goes right back to the Parthenon. So there's nothing particularly new in what I'm saying. Maybe it's just I'm saying it, just putting it in a slightly different shape to it. So anyway, quote, he says, vibrations, cries, or shouts, arrows darting away like rays as if springing from an explosion. The near or distant sight is shaken by them, touched, wounded, dominated, or caressed. That's the end of the quote. So this is a kind of ray space, like the space of Bernini's St. Teresa, the ecstatic space of Bernini's St. Teresa, or the space of that famous 19th century psychotic Judge Schreber, who's a famous case study in psychoanalytic literature, for whom no amount of howling out of his ward window into the storm would stop God from impregnating him with divine rays. He can't, no amount of shouting out his window or no amount of closing up the doors, the sort of shutters on his windows will keep the rays out, simply because the whole logic of it's not because it's like X-rays or Superman, it's simply the logic of inside-outside just doesn't work. So no, architectural thresholds will work there. Another quote, a boundless space opens up, effaces the walls, drives away contingent presences. So this is a space with no thresholds. Okay. So that's Corb's space. For Lacan, the hallmark of psychosis is what he calls the foreclosure to the subject of the symbolic order. It is not repressed, the symbolic order. That would simply produce symptoms, which would be more symbols. with foreclosure, the symbolic order simply doesn't exist. It should be clear that perspective is one of the great symbolic systems, along with the money system, the religion system, the language system, which for Lacan is the preeminent one, the sort of uber symbolic system, all of which constitute the symbolic order. Now, these systems function to join up or unify experience for the subject and to unify discourse between subjects. It guarantees that we are all reading off the same hymn sheet, as they say. It makes both agreement and disagreement possible. With respect to perspective, it allows us to share views. I'll show you mine if you show me yours. We can sort of, show our perspectives to each other. Now, for Lacan, foreclosure is a failure to take up what he calls the master signifier, or the name of the father, the law, the superegoic voice, on exiting the Oedipal stage. And we don't really need to get into that, but essentially the subject, as they mature, kind of take on and incorporate some kind of the voice, the voice of the authorial voice of the parent. Now, this is all pretty abstract, but I think we can see how it works with Brunelleschi's demonstration. We can imagine, well, I don't really have a good, I will just remember that. We can imagine Brunelleschi's authorial voice exhorting, cajoling, threatening his subject to see space the way he wants him to see. We can imagine how the subject, with mirror going up and down, desperately trying to get the alignments right so the thing works, right, would identify this voice, this authorial voice, with the vanishing point and with his own image, right, because the mirror's up, you can see your eye through the people, presumably. And how he might take this, voice up and internalize it as his own. Okay, so it's sort of taking up and internalizing the voice of Brunelleschi, the vanishing point, the mirror image, a certain way of seeing, a certain desire to see a certain way, Brunelleschi's way. Now, whether or not Corb failed the Brunelleschi test as a youngster, we'll never know. But we can see how this symbolic apparatus failed him on the Acropolis. And more importantly, we can see how in our two originary moments of viewing, the neurotic and psychotic positions relate to each other. For Brunelleschi's viewer is turning toward this hallowed object. He's sort of turning toward it and looking through the thing. And Corb is kind of turning away from it, it's this kind of shielding one's gaze, right? It's quite a kind of specific and unique, or not unique, but quite specific kind of moment, this kind of rotating, okay? The turning is important. The sense, whether it's toward or away, is, I think, secondary. Freud talks about turning away from an unbearable reality as a hallmark of fantasy. It's a kind of defense. But in this case, it is more complex than that, because the reality that Brunelleschi's viewer is asked to turn toward is a picture that falsifies reality, or in any case, never aligns with it. And Corb turns toward an object that is real for him precisely because no symbolic apparatus comprising screen, triangulating lines, all of that is there to position him from his object. We need to speculate about the possibility of an ineffable desire in architecture, or a desire beyond the symbol, or a desire stripped of its neuroses. And although for the most part we go on not acknowledging a psychotic desire, trying in other words, to domestify and gentilify snapshots like the one of Corb on the Acropolis, and domestify and gentilify architecture generally, it is perhaps the affinity of Corb's of this desire in psychosis and 20th century culture generally, the affinity between them, that explains the overwhelming impact and reception of Corb's work on the 20th century. So that's kind of me.
Take
sure.
Okay, are there any questions?
I could ask one, a couple. No. Yeah.
I was aware of a letter that Corbusier wrote to, I think it's Victor Nekrasov, in, I think it's 1934, after he was in Moscow, or when he was working in Moscow. This letter is cited by Richard Serra in a lecture he gave at Yale, in which he said he'd visited the churches of the Kremlin and was very impressed by the frescoes, but he was appalled by them as well because they destroyed the wall. And he said this is the problem of the fresco, that if you open up the wall to a picture, it destroys the plane of the wall. And he says it's the same with Michelangelo's ceiling in the Sistine Chapel. It destroys the ceiling and so on. And he's very adamant that the image which is inscribed upon an architectural surface will be at war with that the integrity of that surface. Now, I mean, the Kremlin frescoes were not exactly perspectival. They're kind of medieval, but nevertheless they're pictorial, and you can see what he was getting at. And I just wondered if I don't know, Brunelleschi's determination to fix a perspective upon an interceding or intervening vertical plane, and then to see through it, is, I mean, certainly it's you know, from Corbusier's viewpoint, it would be a completely perverse proposition to put at the beginning of any architectural project. But I'm not quite sure exactly how this fits in, or whether you feel it has any bearing on what you're saying. But I was very impressed by this parallel case of having the gaze of the subject staring at a wall, a vertical plane, which is parallel to the eye, and then see through it, as it were, or virtually through it, into a phenomenal depth. But that when it's actually done on the architectural surface itself, it is destructive of architecture.
I'm not familiar with the letter, although there is a comment in, I was going to say in Towards an Architecture, but I'm actually not sure if it's in there, where he makes that comment that painting destroys the wall, the fresco destroys the wall. Well, I take it it's probably broadly the same comment as in the letter. The first thing is that the I mean, you can understand why an architect would say that if an architect wants to make space and wants to use architectural means to do it, and then a painter comes along and does something that cuts through that. But I think it's important to understand that the destruction of the wall that I'm talking about with the space that I'm saying that we image, I'm just trying to get back to, that we catch a glimpse of here, and which Corb then 20 years later writes about as, or 10 years later, 15 years later writes about as ineffable space. The way in which the wall disappears in these spaces is quite a bit different from that, because the painting on the wall is still tarrying in this kind of symbolic apparatus of image making and walls that define spaces or not, you know, as it may be. And what I think is, what I'm getting at here is simply the possibility of another, kind of space which, where inside and outside are not intelligible. It's a space that simply where the logic of inside-outside doesn't obtain, so that the comment that Corb makes in this case simply wouldn't be intelligible. Okay? That comment is still within, this kind of space making, essentially. You said something else too about the perversity of erecting a panel between a person and his or her object, and then painting an image of the object on that panel. And I have to say, that's a perversity which keeps me awake at night. I love that. I mean, just going back to this, why, if he wants her so badly, why is he sitting there painting a picture of her or doing a drawing of her? I mean, it's the same thing. And it's about, and it has to be about the idea that his desire is just simply so unbearable to him that he can't live with it without erecting all this kind of apparatus between him and his object. Okay? Something like that. I mean, otherwise, why would you do that? Why would you erect this shield that not only either literally or metaphorically puts a plane between you and your object, but then conceptualizes it as a series of triangulating lines which, kind of fix us from our objects. Okay?
But I mean, it seems at that point that you open up the question of what you might call the other side of what you said about perspective. I mean, at one point you say, in the church, say, of Lacan, you have the feeling that there is a path to the object of desire, and that therefore, in some sense, it encourages a kind of sense of omnipotence. But by the same token, it encourages also a sense of influence, because the very thing that shows you that you could get there is the same thing that shows you you can't get there, that there is a milieu of existence. And I think that leads on, to the second point. I mean, what's very interesting, it seems to me, for example, in the Brunelleschi in Lorenzo, is really this. It's not just in the Quattrocento that people, some historians would still say, discovered the laws of perspective. Well, in a sense, if that's all they've done, they would simply now have a new capacity to represent objects in space. Let's call it, in a simple way, correctly. But what one's above all aware in Brunelleschi church is that the building, the architecture, has become perspectivalized, which in a sense is quite separate from the issue of perspective. Suddenly, the world gets objects and representations of objects which make everything look perspectival. So that, in addition to perspective, you're continuously introduced into a sort of perspectival wall. I suppose, in a sense, the exception to the core point about the picture destroying the space, or rather the opposite of it, is in, you can think of various Gladian houses where the use of Tom employs, in a sense, is the reverse. That is to say, it tries to present an external view which is all consistent with the sort of perspective. And so far from destroying the wall, is able miraculously to falsely create a window. But it feels consistent.
Well, the case of the church in Milan by Brunelleschi that really does have a continuation of the apparent perspective on the wall behind the altar, so that if you stood in the Brunelleschi position, it looks as if the building is continuing. So by that means the wall is destroyed, but in some way the building is perpetuated or extended.
Can I just get back to what you were saying about the impotence, the fantasy of omnipotence and the fear of impotence, right? Which is what seems to be at work there. I mean, a couple of things. The form you put that in is very close to the what in Lacan's article, The Mirror Stage, where he talks about when the sort of one of the stages in the critical moments in the sort of identity of the subject, the ability of the subject to identify themselves, is that they assume an image. You suddenly realize, oh, gee, I'm an object in the world. I have an image. You know, I'm looking in the mirror and I see that for the first time. I have an image just like any other, and it's tied to things like separation from the mother. He says that this moment where the subject assumes an image and finally has an identity projects themselves into this, I forget the exact words, but always to be on this kind of spectrum between insufficiency and anticipation. In other words, you look in the mirror and you always see somebody slightly uglier than you hope you saw. But at the same time, the mirror always allows you a glimpse of the person, the beautiful person that you just might become. It changes a little bit with age, I've noticed, but it still works. That so between insufficiency, between being less than you wish you were, and anticipation, being more than that. That whole kind of dynamic is, I think, wrapped up with this sort of the perspectival image and the perspectival architecture that makes it. And what I was trying to get at with this thing about if we can take it out of that register and understand our relations to our objects in terms of interpretation or analysis, I'm thinking a little bit of what I think Freud said once, that what the job of analysis was to sort of make neurotically unhappy people just kind of like ordinarily unhappy. And behind that, I think, is this notion that we're never really satisfied with our objects, and that we're never really satisfied with our own wholeness and completion. And we're always kind of slightly somewhere else than we want to be. We're, in other words, constructed around loss. And it's the job of analysis, what I've been saying interpretation, but I mean analysis. I mean the ability to sort of speak freely by free association and to have somebody listen to that with the kind of free floating attention. It's the job of analysis to kind of like reconcile ourselves to that. You don't promise that if you dive through that screen or walk down the nave, you may actually get that object and then maybe trigger all those fears about, oh, what happens if I don't make it? What happens if the wires make me go boing and I spring back or something? You don't you don't try to reconcile people with the idea that the job of analysis is not to reconcile, is not to convince people that they may yet get the object. It's to reconcile them to the fact that they'll never get it. Okay, and so it's that, which, this image and the nave image is always about, the promise that, if you just keep walking far enough, or if you have enough energy, you'll get there. And analysis is about reconciling ourselves to the fact that we simply won't. And it's probably why, as I said, Corb looks so miserable, with these objects. And it's about, and it's simply that there's different, the perspectival space. You can obviously analyze anything and interpret anything in any kind of a space, but the perspectival image simply represses that possibility because it offers this kind of, fantasy possibility. So it's just about, which. That's primarily why Lacan is so kind of like distressed with the perspectival image.
In which case, I agree with you. The human being, by definition, is something that's like at the wrong place at the wrong time by its nature. If that's kind of what you can live with. Analysis, and the political constant is that progressive politics demonstrates to you that everyone else is in just as bad a condition as you are. So actually, there's no point like wanting what they've got or whatever, because they're all miserable. I think that's always quite serious. I also wonder if you think that Corbusier is a type of powerful oppressive power, being oppressed so powerfully, has Huffman been intact? Because there's something, because in them, again, there has to be more perspective. That the power of things is released by
Well, I could. Yeah. Yes.
I was just thinking of the difference between the image of the nave and the experiment. Because what happens in the experiment, in this kind of pulling up and down of the mirror, that movement has been described as a movement that triggers desire. A movement that triggers desire.
Yes.
Like this, I'm thinking of Rosalind Krauss in the Optical Unconscious. I'm just thinking that how that I think there's two things that are incredibly different, like in terms of a unique image of an outer, and this image of something alternating, something oscillating, which actually, can speak about the desire to match, but can also speak about the impossibility of matching the two images. So, in relation to the desire and the symbolic apparatus, maybe what I'm trying to think is like maybe the architecture speaks within the symbolic apparatus, and the experiment speaks about the impossibility of the symbolic apparatus, and therefore the desire beyond it. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. It's interesting to me because I simply have never thought of it that way. I look at the demonstration as one of the great symbolic acts of construction. I mean, I see that as wittingly or no, kind of constructing this vast symbolic edifice of vision, not kind of working against it or something. Yeah. It's the key to its own unraveling, as I was trying to show with these kind of montages, this kind of lack of fit. You'll have to tell me more about that.
think they're still selling the book in the South Jury Room, so if anyone feels called upon to buy it, and I encourage you all to, it's an extremely interesting and impressive argument. And I'd like on your behalf to really thank Lorens for coming and speaking this evening. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, go by.